Welcome to Methods Talk, the Methods at Manchester podcast. I'm Professor Emma Bannister, the Director of Methods at Manchester. In this episode, we meet Dr. Njabulo Chepangura from Manchester Museum, part of the University of Manchester. Njabu is the museum's curator of living cultures and is responsible for the care of objects from Africa, Asia, Oceania and the Americas. A key part of this role is a concern with decolonising the museum through co-production, co-curatorship and collaborating with relevant communities, and developing collections in ways that express the caring, imaginative and inclusive purpose of Manchester Museum. Njabu led a workshop for Methods at Manchester as part of the Being Human Festival, where African diaspora communities were invited into the museum for an object handling session to share stories and understandings as part of a collaborative approach to reimagining meanings. We started with me asking Njabu to say a little bit about his role at the museum.
Thank you, Emma, for inviting me to be on this podcast. So my name is Dr. Njabulo Chepangura. I'm a curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum, which is part of the university. I was appointed curator of living cultures on the 11th of January in 2022. So I've been on post for the past 3 years, getting to 3 years. So before I was appointed curator of living cultures, I used to work for the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe as a curator of archaeology. And I spent 10 years of my early curatorial work at the National Museums in Zimbabwe. And that's when I moved to Manchester. So at Manchester Museum, as a curator of living culture, essentially I'm a curator of anthropology. I'm responsible for taking care of anthropological objects that were collected by the British Empire from different parts of the world. So within my care, I look after objects from Africa, the Americas, Oceania, Asia, and also, apart from the objects, we also have ancestral remains that were also collected during the colonial period, are brought to museums as trophies of colonial conquest.
Wow.
So it's not only anthropological objects or living cultures. We do have what I prefer to call dehumanized ancestors brought from these geographic regions where the empire was expanding to, colonizing not just the territorial landscapes, but also colonizing and appropriating cultural heritage objects of the people of Africa, Americas, Oceania, and Asia, and the ancestral remains as well. So in terms of numbers, I'll give you a bit of the numbers of collection that we hold. So the African collection has approximately 15,000 objects, and it's the largest, followed by the Oceania collection with approximately 6,500, followed by the Asia collection with approximately 4,500, and lastly we have the Americas with approximately 4,000. I do have a count for the ancestral remains. I know how many there are, but because we're trying to rehumanize them, I'm not at liberty to keep on giving out a count of ancestors. And these ancestors, they come in different formats. Can be hair pieces, can be nails, there can be skulls, body parts, and all those things. So it's a combination of different body parts that we have in museums that constitute these ancestors. So the work that I've been doing is on rehumanizing the ancestors. How then do we acknowledge that this collection that we hold is problematic? And how do we initiate dialogue with communities of origins, for example, or African diaspora communities to ethically take care of these ancestors, or to ethically take care of the living cultures that were collected during the colonial period. So my role is built on the understanding that these are not just anthropological objects that I care for, but these are living cultures because they're coming from a context of people who live it, who lost their heritage as a function of colonial violence. But most importantly, I see myself as a custodian of people's heritage. Yes, I'm a curator, I have a PhD in anthropology, but that's not enough. I don't know everything about 15,000 heritage objects of the people of Africa. I'll be lying to you, Emma. So I'm a custodian. I facilitate a space where people can come and have a say on their own cultural heritage in a museum. I aim to build sustainable working relationships with these communities, in redefining the meanings of the living cultures, in giving the ancestors a bit of respect, which perhaps ultimately all these conversations would lead to calls for the repatriation and restitution of some of these unethically acquired cultural heritage objects and ancestors.
Right. That's, wow. I mean, that's really, really interesting. I mean, as you sort of, you talk about your role, how you see your role, has that kind of developed in the time that you've been in post? Like, was it presented to you as this is what comes under your role, or does that up for?
Well, I'll say this essentially, the role is about curating anthropological objects. As I say to you, the diversity of the collection cuts across different regions, right? The Africa collection is part of the collection, the Americas, Asia, Oceania. But I think the focus was on, for the first time, Manchester Museum wanted to look at African collections carefully. Why? There's been debates that have been ongoing on demands for the restitution of African cultural heritage objects. These debates are ongoing. They started off with the Benin bronzes from Nigeria, which were looted in 1897. And most European museums benefited from this violent loot of Benin cultural heritage objects. And apparently Manchester Museum also holds collections of Benin cultural heritage objects. So Benin cultural heritage objects have been on the spotlight for a very, very long time. And most museums are trying to do the best thing in terms of returning these heritage objects to the Kingdom of Benin. So for Manchester Museum, I guess the point of my appointment was to take this work even further, but to progress the work on the repatriation and restitution of African cultural heritage objects. But not only that, repatriations can only be undertaken in a space where we know exactly where we're taking this object to. So part of the work that I do involves conducting provenance research.
Right.
We just don't give objects out, but there's a lot that goes through a repatriation process. We undertake provenance research, not just as a function of tracing the legal ownership of the objects, but also how do you conduct this provenance in collaboration. It's a very interesting decolonial methodology. We're talking about decolonizing methods today, right? So from a museum perspective, what are these decolonial methodologies that museums can embrace in undertaking provenance research on problematic collections that came from Africa? These are colonial contexts, collections that are coming from the colonial context. So we know clearly that these came from different colonies, right, that were under the British Empire. And there's no doubt. There's the provenance we know, but what we don't know is the biography, which is a very interesting concept altogether. When you look at provenance research, you trace where things were taken from, right? We know the countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Nigeria, Malawi, Tanzania, Botswana, South Africa. We know it's recorded, right? That's what we have in the museum, places or countries. But the communities themselves, they're not even spoken about. We don't even know who they were. It's silent, completely silent. It's like, it's an object from Zimbabwe, so what? That's anthropology.
Right.
That brings me to the whole idea of anthropology as a discipline with colonial foundation. Because the idea was representation of people's cultures, right? What we call Agabing anthropology. We don't have the people with us here, but we put their objects. This is how we can represent them in a museum. That's it.
And I guess that leads on for me to ask specifically about the terminology associated with your role. So, curator of living cultures. Do you want to say anything specific?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. It's a very catchy title. I'm always asked by people, what is living cultures? So the idea really, ordinarily I'm a curator of anthropology. If we look at how museums are also, foregrounded by disciplines, right? A spaces of knowledge production, right? Where I was 6 curators at Manchester Museum. Myself, curator of anthropology, there's curator of archaeology, there's curator of botany, there's curator of zoology, there's curator of Egyptology and Sudan, there's curator of entomology. So all of us were collections curators, but these collections are situated within disciplines, right? Disciplines, right, of knowledge production. So what is the knowledge that anthropology gives us? It's cultural knowledge, right? So living cultures is a departure from seeing anthropological objects that are coming from colonial context as frozen, lifeless, static, and as things that we come to admire and gaze in a museum, but rather beneath the making of these objects in their points of origins. These were not made to be in a museum. They were made to be used in different cultural practices. They were living objects. They were living when they were made. They were made to be used as living cultures, right? To be replenished, to be destroyed. It's a cycle of life. When objects are created, they are created to be used within specific context, destroyed, and then they will make more objects. That's why I would say, for example, if you look at the amount of African cultural heritage objects that are in museums, it's telling. Here in the global north or in Europe, there are plenty of museums with African materials, similar African materials. Not only Manchester Museum, you go to Pitt Rivers Museum, you go to Cambridge University Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, you go to Liverpool, you go to Birmingham, you name all these ethnographic museums, they have similar African cultural heritage objects. Why? Because these are living cultures. They were made in numbers, like they were produced in numbers as living. They don't die when they go to a museum or when they're in a museum basement. They're dead.
Right.
They're just dead. So this is where my role comes into play. We don't see those objects at Manchester Museum as anthropological objects. They are living cultures because we are decentering the anthropological notion of objectifying things as representation of cultures. But let's not just represent the cultures from materiality, but from looking at the uses and the functions of these living cultures from their point of origins or from their point of production.
That's really interesting. So you're sort of a major part of your role is bringing the living
alive
back into, bringing
objects back into life.
Okay.
Right? Because as they are not alive. They are museum objects in boxes, in glass cases, right? They're frozen, like a timeless past, right? This is the past. So this is the past that is represented by these drums from Zimbabwe, these drums from Malawi, these baskets from Zambia. That's it. That's it. So the living is also a function of looking and searching for the biography of the object, right? Biography, the life history of an object from birth to use to disposal. Right. Now in a museum, they're static, they're frozen, they're lifeless. But we can give them back their life. How? That's the question.
Well, that was going to be my question for you.
So collaboration. Now I'm in a decolonial moment, right? I think the word decolonization has been abused significantly in academia. People talk about decolonization from a very epistemological point of view, right? It's quite popular. I think it's a catchy phrase. It's a buzzword, right? It's fine. Mm-hmm. But for me, when you want to look at what decolonization means in museums with collections from colonial contexts, like Manchester, for example, it's a very simple thing. These material culture, these objects were collected within a colonial moment. We know that these are vestiges of colonization. Then how do you decolonize practically? Because already a museum is not a space for theory. It's a practical space. Mm-hmm. These are the practicalities of colonization. We do have these objects. How do we decolonize that collection? So the core would be one methodology. There are plenty, I can go on and on, but there are plenty ways of decolonizing collections from colonial context. One entry level of decolonization, which I have been doing, is carefully looking at some of the labels on the objects. Mm-hmm. Up to today, you will be shocked that a museum like Manchester still have got derogatory and offensive labels on objects collected from the people of Africa during colonial rule. I'm not going to speak about the other ways on this podcast, but they're so dehumanizing,
right,
offensive. But why are we failing to do an ordinary and basic entry level discussion of decolonizing museum objects on museum collections? label. Sorry, it's like, why can't we just change?
But how have those labels been able to continue? Is it just ignorance that?
Well, I guess it's just a lack of knowledge on the vernacular meanings of these objects to the communities. That's where you bring these collaborations as a methodology. If you collaborate with people with lived experience as a form of knowledge can be harnessed by bringing Africa diaspora community members in Manchester, bring them to the museum, right? Remember, museums used to be very exclusive in the past. If you want to be inclusive, right, is another very interesting decolonial way. Inclusivity. Let's bring those communities to the museum. Let's collaborate with them. Let's give them the space to look at their own heritage objects. They would know from their lived experience the vernacular meanings or the vernacular names of this object which is written. Fetish, for example, fetish object. A fetish means, it came from these societies who were believing and praying to these objects as their demigods, right? That's a fetish object. Let's take this object away from these people. And most of our fetish objects, as an example of a collecting practice, they were brought in by missionaries.
Right.
So I can zero in a bit on collecting practices in museums. So we do have a number of ways in which our African collections were brought. Missionaries brought, I think 80% of our collections are coming from missionary-led collections. How? Missionaries are going to Africa, right, with a view of trying to convert African natives into Christianity. So one best way of doing that would be dispossessing African communities from their African traditional religious objects. So let's take these objects from them as a way of trying to convert them into Christianity. Loads of objects, loads of them came from missionary societies that were operating in Africa, especially objects from Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. There were a number of missionary societies that collected and brought the object to museums. That's one. We also have salvage anthropology, which was very popular at the time, which literally means that we are rescuing these cultures from becoming extinct. That's salvaging. So let's salvage from there. If we leave these drums in Africa, if we leave these baskets, they'll be extinct. They'll die.
Yeah, almost like animals. Like
yes.
Take them.
So let's take them, bring them and put them in a museum. And then we have got violent collecting practices like looting, appropriations, and all that. And we also have exchanges amongst museums. Like museums, we also exchange objects. For example, Manchester Museum, we received a large chunk of our African collections from Salford Museum in 1969. So there was this exchange between Salford Museum and Manchester Museum. Salford Museum received a number of European antiquities from Manchester, and then Salford Museum gave Manchester Museum all of its African collection. So that's how Manchester Museum started this kind of specialization in African cultural heritage objects. Many museums also benefited from this kind of...
Really?
Let Manchester Museum specialize on African collections, right? In the north, and then maybe with Liverpool Museum. If you want to go and see African objects, then go to Liverpool, Manchester. You can't see in Bolton, you can't see in Salford, you can't see in these other smaller museums in the Northwest. So this is how these collections were structured deliberately to centralize a particular region of focus of collections.
Brilliant. Okay. So you sort of talked about decolonization as a methodology. So are you sort of able to give us a sort of sense of what that means in a museum context? And you've sort of said it's been, the term has been abused a little bit. So what are the core understandings, I guess?
So from a museum perspective, actually from a general academic perspective, I think I'll say decolonization is a knowledge sharing method, right? It's sharing authority. It's acknowledging that there are multiple ways of knowing and doing, right? We can study, we can research in collaborations with different knowledges apart from our Western hegemonic ways of knowing and doing. So in a museum, practically, because museums, they do have the real residue or evidence of coloniality through these material cultures. One way of decolonizing, one strategy to me would be starting off by acknowledging the problematic circumstances around how these collections were collected through accountability, truth-telling, openness, and disclosure. These are decolonial methodologies in the measure. You account for the circumstance of how your African cultural heritage objects were collected. And in most cases, this is acknowledging the colonial violence that is associated with the collection. But that's the entry point of decolonizing. If you don't do that, then you're starting at level number 7 or 9. First level for me is that honesty, that empathy of saying, we know that these objects from the people of Africa were looted, they were stolen, they were appropriated. We know that our foundations as a museum are closely linked with the empire.
And there's a whole language with that as well, isn't there? I noticed the use of the word violence. Not cutting corners, just
bluntly said, this is where we sit. Yes, we want to decolonize ourselves, but before we do the decolonial work, we are acknowledging the circumstances around how our collections came to be what they are in Manchester. Then if you do that, that's an entry level. All the other strategies will follow. This is where you now want to become inclusive. You want to collaborate. Collaboration can only happen in a space where the history of the collection is not. And this history can be told from a truth-telling perspective, right? From a disclosure on the circumstances. Whether it's missionaries, it's people were looting, grave robberies, whatever you call it. Please tell the truth about those circumstances. Communities will feel honored to know, right, that the museum is acknowledging the ills of the past. And the museum is ready to collaborate with us, not to extract from us cultural knowledge, right? So when you collaborate, then other methods would fall into place, like provenance research. It can be collaborative as well. Instead of me doing it as an anthropologist, then I can work with communities broadly defined as diasporans or African communities to do the provenance research of these problematic collections, as well as the biographical research. Then another interesting methodology would be co-curatorship, co-production, co-creation. Museums are known for exhibitions, right? I mean, people go to museums to see. I said earlier on, they're more like visual machines, right? But not only making the visual machines, what you see must not be the authoritarian function of a curator. Like myself as a curator, I must not be the one who knows everything. Because I don't know everything. Let's collaborate. Let's co-create. Let's co-curate exhibitions. I'll give you a very good example. One of our galleries at Manchester Museum is called the South Asian Gallery. Literally, the whole gallery was co-produced by a collective of 23 co-curators of South Asia heritage. What we did as curators was to give them the space to think about their own heritage, to exhibit their own narratives, their own stories of being people of South Asian heritage. The lead curator, a colleague of mine, Nusrat Ahmed, she was there coordinating and facilitating, not telling people stories of their heritage. So if you do that, then to me, literally, co-production or co-curatorship is a very interesting decolonial methodology which museums can undertake. Related to this provenance research, what would the point of doing provenance research collaboratively with communities? The other very interesting big elephant in the room is repatriation and restitution. Scary word, right? I know people are scared. Museums are going to become empty. People don't want to repatriate for different reasons. But for me, having been involved in a landmark restitution project at Manchester Museum, I would say there's no loss whatsoever when museums return objects to communities of origins. Actually, we stand to benefit even more in terms of building relationships with communities of origins when we retain their cultural heritage objects. An example, Emma, last year, I'm sure you've read about this, we returned 174 cultural heritage objects back to the Andiliakwa people of Cook Island in Northern Australia. It's an Aboriginal community. The collection was collected, or the objects rather were collected by Professor Peter Worsley, very famous social anthropologist, British, is regarded as the father of social anthropology.
Right.
Most people, I'm sure most anthropologists would know him. So he was doing his PhD study in Andiliakwa in the 1940s. And then he collected boomerangs, fishing sticks, magic dolls, back painting as an anthropological practice of that time.
Yeah.
Of, studying people's culture through their material cultures by collecting and trying to, classify them and read their cultures from their objects. It was ethical by that time.
Mm-hmm.
It was a research.
He said it.
Yeah, it was called. It was PhD, anthropology. I mean, he spent 5 years of his time, 3 years, 5 years, 3 to 5 years, learned the language, and he was speaking fluent language. He was part of the community, but he was also studying them.
Mm-hmm.
Participant observation, bringing with him to Manchester the objects, and was appointed a professor of anthropology, one of the earliest professors of social anthropology. And then when he retired in 1983, he donated the whole so-called Peter Worsley collection to Manchester. It was his collection, not the Andiliakwa collection.
Yeah.
Peter Worsley. That's a famous museum way of classification.
Yeah.
We speak more about the collector. The communities are not even not. It's classic museum.
Yeah.
Misrepresentation, I would say. So over time, working with our colleagues at the Australian Institute for the Study of Aboriginal and Torres Islanders, called IAXIS, we identified this collection from Peter Worsley as one positive way in which we can reach out proactively to the community without waiting for them to come with a claim. Because in most cases, they wait for a claim.
Yeah.
But communities will never put a claim if they don't know what you hold.
Yeah.
I mean, how a good example, I'll go back to the African collection, 15,000 objects from Africa. How many people in Africa would know that Manchester Museum is on those objects? Nobody. It's the duty of a curator to be more proactive. Proactivity is a decolonial methodology as well, like proactively identifying and ethically acquired heritage materials and letting the communities know this is what we hold from your country, and giving them the agency to decide for themselves when they want to have the objects back or not. Because Emma, it's not in all cases where people want to have things back.
Yeah, but they probably want to be told, and they want the offer to be.
They want them to be represented properly.
Yeah.
They want their stories to be known in Manchester, right? They'll feel happy that this collection that came from South Africa is now being exhibited from our perspective in a museum in Manchester. That's part of what collaborations will do for you if you openly engage with the communities. Coming back to the Andiliakwa repatriation. So we went there. Myself, a colleague of mine, Dr. Alexandra Abeda, who's our curator of Indigenous Perspectives, and our head of collections, Georgina Young, who went to the Andiliakwa community in Australia, spent some time on the island. All we had then were not the objects, but the pictures of the objects, the visual representations. We showed them that this is what we hold in Manchester, in the UK. So 16,000 miles away from you, this is your heritage. And talking to senior elders, they were at point of crying just seeing all those objects just lay in the museum. Some of them were still everyday objects that they were still making on the island, like fishing sticks, for example, similar fishing sticks to what Peter was.
Right.
Like duplicates, like similar, up to today.
Yeah.
That's the story, right? These communities do have cultural knowledge of producing similar cultural objects collected 80-something years ago by Peter Worsley.
And that really brings meaning to that idea of living cultures as well,
Yes.
doesn't it? Rather than
Yes, so they are living cultures because within the Andile community, they're still making similar cultural heritage objects. They're still using them to fish. They're still doing back painting. They're still doing magic dolls. Like, it's an everyday cultural practice, right? So the living is more visible when you collaborate and engage with communities. You see them making similar objects that you hold in a museum.
Okay. So that's really interesting. Let's sort of go back to the African,
Yes.
if that's okay, because I wanted to talk to you about the workshop that we did together as part of Methods at Manchester. Well, it was part of the Being Human Festival, wasn't it? And I think that gave me huge insight into some of the work that you're doing in terms of co-production and collaboration. So I wondered if you wanted to sort of tell us a little bit about that event, because I think it's sounds to me like a sort of micronism of what you're doing more broadly.
Yeah, so I mean, thanks to you and Dr. Sophia West for the collaboration. I mean, the event, I wouldn't say it was a Manchester Museum kind of initiative, but it was a collaboration through Methods Manchester, and work together in bringing a group of African diasporans through their community leads. So most of these people, I've been working with them directly or indirectly in other projects. For example, with Africa Day this year on the 25th of May, which also brought together a number of African diasporans. And for the first time in Manchester, at Manchester Museum, they were able to see some of these concealed hidden objects, and they were able to tell stories about these objects. So our ambition is to open the museum to people of African heritage, so they can be able to see their objects, and they can also tell stories from their own perspective. So that's a similar approach that we took for the Being Human Festival workshop on decolonizing and reimagining co-curatorship and co-production at Manchester Museum. So we brought community leads and their representatives from Zimbabwe, Malawi, Nigeria, DRC, and one woman from Kenya. So they were able to view objects that are provenance. The whole idea of provenance is coming back again. Provenance, they came from these specific countries. Because we know that a certain collector or a certain missionary was working in Zimbabwe, they were working in Malawi, they were working in DRC, they were working in Nigeria, they were working in Kenya, and then they brought these objects. So the provenance was undoubtable, it was unquestionable. Labels were written, some of them, of course, their own provenance, which the participants were able to pick. So we brought a representation of those living cultures from the different countries that I've mentioned, 5 per country. And then we allowed these African diaspora partners to engage openly, to touch the object. Because for a long time, or ordinarily in a museum, you're not allowed to touch an object for conservation purposes, right? Because when you touch, the object is going to deteriorate. But for me, the approach was to make a connection with these living cultures. So these communities are supposed to feel their heritage because it's part of their everyday life that they've been denied for a very, very long time, because objects are conserved in a museum to live forever. But for whom? Who are they living forever for in a museum?
And at what cost as well?
What cost? Yeah. So out of that engagement, open engagement, numerous stories came out. Like even I, as a curator, I want to profess, Emma, it's like those stories ordinarily, even through my own anthropological research, I would never have got to hear those biographies about that cup from DRC.
Yeah.
And how that cup is being misrepresented as an ordinary object, about the baskets and bowls from Zimbabwe.
Yeah. How
they are used, about the beaded gold from Zimbabwe that is used for marriage rights. That is given to a girl, they're married, and it's supposed to be kept in the family house up until she passes on.
Yeah.
That gold is supposed to be seen on the day of her death. If the family fails to produce that, then they're fined. Right? So those stories were not intimately connected to the people. They know, they've lived through those stories.
And it's them feeling comfortable telling those stories. I mean, the story you just said, when the women who were talking about that, they kind of whispered in my ear at some point during that session. They said, "This is for you because you're a woman." But it's like the sort of feeling that you're in the surroundings where you can
you are given the safe space.
Yeah,
it's the safe space to speak about your own narratives, your own stories. Not only speaking about them, but also relating them with the material culture that a museum like Manchester holds, right?
Yeah.
And for me, those biographies, they are going to change the ways in which we see or view some of these African objects. Because already I'm isolating some of the sensitive cultural materials and removing them from just being bunched together with other anthropological objects. Because those stories that came from the women from Zimbabwe, I mean, the gout must be put somewhere away from the ordinary object, because it's not an ordinary object.
Yeah.
It's not.
I mean, that was actually really interesting. You mentioned the cup, and it was by not saying much, you're kind of also devaluing that object, because that conversation came about because there was a label which simply said wooden cup.
Yeah.
It was like, that can never be enough to describe to describe that.
Yeah. So I guess there is value in having those open conversations and allowing communities of origins to be able to see and to view. Obviously, there's so much to see in the basement, but we can't bring out everything.
Yeah.
So that method is a starting point towards our vision of, bringing objects from the basement. And also our aspiration is to have a dedicated space at Manchester Museum where African diasporans would be able to co-create, co-produce their own exhibition.
So it becomes a sort of ongoing thing rather than, because I was wondering that, because it's quite difficult, isn't it? How do you replicate what you did a few weeks ago on a sort of larger scale? And whether sometimes when something seemed really quite ambitious, so thinking about opening the gallery up or whatever, whether it almost halts progression because it's seen as such a big thing. But I think it's quite interesting hearing you say there's different levels of that decolonisation methodology, and is there some sense of allowing yourself not to get there, but actually the progression towards there is...
Even the whole decolonization is a discourse. I mean, for me, I usually carefully think about it as a step towards decolonization. We won't get a complete decolonization, but I think that we can do is a means to an end, right? Is a means towards decolonizing this African collection. So what we are doing right now, what we did during the Big Human Festival, is a decolonial way of, engaging with the object. But what will be the result? At the end of the day, we're going to come up with a digital exhibition, right? That's a product, right?
Yeah.
A film, that's a product, right? The co-curatorship notes that we're capturing, that's a product, right? So that's going to contribute towards redefining the African collection at Manchester Museum. The exhibition will come, yes, but maybe later on. But as of now, we are concerned with harnessing meanings, not for ourselves, but doing that in collaboration with these communities as we move forward to the future of the African collection at Manchester Museum.
Right. And I wanted to ask you about yourself in all of this, because obviously as a sort of African man and, in terms of your own sort of training, museum studies in anthropology and, sort of your own positionality, because I guess there must be sort of growth and sort of development in sort of, I mean, and also whether it's sometimes very uncomfortable for you or, if you could sort of talk.
I mean, it's always difficult really to separate my positionalities, because I've got a dual positionality here. I'm an academic for a PhD in anthropology, trained as an anthropologist, studied museum studies and archaeology, all that. So that standard practice of doing anthropology through ethnography, through all those other methodologies, I still have it. I'm still trained to do that. But at the same time, working in a museum with living objects, part of it is my own heritage, like objects from Zimbabwe, for example, or South Africa, or Zambia, which I clearly, most of them I know them, I've seen them being used. So how then do I bring that lived experience, or how do I make that lived experience inform my academic head as a curator of anthropology? It's a difficult thing to do, but at the same time, I think it's an advantage for me to have all those dual eyes, right? Because anthropologically, I can converse in the anthropological method, the standard methods of doing anthropology. I know them. I've done them in my PhD. I know. At the same time, bringing lived experience as a form of knowledge can also be seen as a way of trying to decolonize anthropology as a discipline. Because remember I said earlier on, anthropology has colonial foundations, right? The way people view anthropology even today, you can't separate anthropologists with studying cultures of the other. And the museum becomes worse, because the museum becomes that space where these cultures are exhibited. Right? This is just the visual gaze or the aesthetic gaze of things. But walking into Manchester Museum when I was appointed, I think the burden was so heavy on me on how I'm going to navigate the space, right? The space of being responsible for this huge collection of African objects, and not only objects, but also the ancestors that I spoke to you about. That's quite sensitive, traumatic experiences. If you ask me, I rarely go to the organic store where these ancestors are kept, unless, of course, I'm mentally prepared to go there. That's part of my work, but it's not a comfortable zone to always be looking at dead people in small little boxes, right, that we call human remains. So the task was so daunting on me on how to navigate a space which is very, very traumatic, sensitive cultural material, sensitive ancestors of living people. How do I work myself out of this, and how do I make sure that I'm giving these ancestors respect? Right? They are not buried, but they deserve to be respected. So what we did, I was tasked to lead on revising the human remains policy of Manchester Museum. I speak to you right now. I think the draft is almost ready. So we're no longer going to call them human remains, their ancestors. And every study that is associated with ancestral remains at Manchester Museum, we've put a stop to that. Because in the past, we have colleagues from physical anatomy, physical biology, physical anthropology would want to come and take samples of real. But right now, our new policy says, we can't keep on allowing the dehumanization of these ancestors. We're working towards rehumanizing them, even in the absence of reburying them or repatriating them. The suggestion that we're thinking about is what would it mean to create a public memorial, a public cemetery where these ancestors for people from Africa are just buried, right, in the ground where they belong, not in a museum. And people of African heritage can go to those memorials in Manchester to pay their remembrance, just like a Remembrance Day, just as a memorial. That way, these ancestors will get the peace that they deserve after having been dehumanized and kept in a little box for, I don't know, more than 150 years or so.
It's just such, when you talk about your role and, when we sort of consider perhaps as an outsider what a curator does, it's just so varied, and the skills that you have to have to be able to carry out that role, it's just absolutely amazing, actually. When I was sort of asked about positionality as well, we had our previous podcast, actually, we had a podcast episode with Chloe Stedman, and she was talking about researcher vulnerability and using your vulnerabilities, kind of acknowledging that they are there. And I can sort of see some of those kind of themes in the work that you talk about, because actually it's kind of cues as to what is acceptable and different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a different way of talking about lived experience, maybe, isn't it?
Yeah. Of course, lived experience can also complement, like in my role, it's not like I'm negating standard ways of conserving, keeping African anthropology.
Yeah.
No, the museum is not going to lose anything by engaging.
Yeah.
So you benefit from stories that we didn't have prior to this engagement. So it's a question. The question for me is, how then do we develop a hybrid methodology, like a hybrid method of working with these communities, with these people of African heritage, and also respecting their knowledge, which brings me to the point of most of the time we think of just extracting from collaborators. Collaborations are also unequal in a lot of ways. We think of collaboration as a decolonial methodology, but there are power dynamics around collaboration that I'm still a curator. I still got authority.
Yeah.
I still can navigate around systems.
You've got your day job.
I know. So I can still get out with some of it. But not to say that's what we need to do with our communities. I think we need to be very respectful, equitable, and open as well. And make sure that these people feel valued for their knowledge. They're still paying for their time, like what we did for the methods workshop. It's not like we just brought those people to just tell us stories about these objects, but they also feel valued for coming to Manchester and being assisted for their transport, for their lunch, and for their, for the time that they were in the museum. That to me is a very, very important way of working relationally with communities.
Okay. All right. It's been absolutely fascinating. I just wondered if we could sort of finish with just some sort of sense of, but what's next? What are the next steps?
Yeah. So the biggest picture is we aim to have a space, as I said to you, where African stories are told. I'm not going to call it a gallery. I actually hate the word gallery because it's kind of reductionist in terms of just having this space with African heritage, like things are just in a glass case. So what I think should be done, what we need to do as Manchester Museum going forward, is to give African diasporans or people for African heritage on the continent a big space where they can explore their own heritages using the objects that we currently hold. So we're going to make a connection between the collections and the communities. So the stories that are going to be told are not stories of anthropological research. These are stories that are emanating from communities of origins and African diasporans in a dedicated space. I don't have a name so far, but I think it's going to go beyond a diorama, like a normal diorama.
Right.
Diorama, things that you're going to see from Africa. No, it's going to be a performative space, space of rituals, a space of dance, a space of poetry, a space of drama. All of these are living, but I'm going to connect these to the dead objects in the museum. That's what I envisage to be the next step towards the work that we have been doing with the African collections.
That's absolutely amazing. Is there anything else you wanted to sort of mention in terms of people's understanding?
No, I think the call for action for me is whether you're of African diaspora or you're just interested in African heritage, I'm always free to let people see what we have in the basement. Anytime that perhaps maybe you're seeing this podcast for the first time, you didn't know Manchester Museum holds 15,000 objects. If you feel you are connected in any way, please feel free to get in touch with us. I'm always there at Manchester Museum. Come to the reception, look for Dr. Njabulo Chipangura, and I can show you through. And practically, if I take you to the basement, perhaps all of these narratives that I'm talking about here will come alive. You can collaborate even more.
Yeah. I mean, that's really generous of you. And I can see how sort of infused and how open you are about your work. So Manchester Museum and Manchester University are very, very honoured to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you.